Welcome to what you need to know about oil paints. So if you're new to oil painting, understanding the unique nature of oil paints and how to choose the right ones can make all the difference in your oil painting journey. Now, as with any art supplies, there's going to be a wide variety available to you. Anything from very affordable to extremely expensive, and each of them has their pros and cons. So in today's tutorial, we're going to take a look at the specific nature of oil paints and what makes them so special. And we're also going to navigate all the different brands and what to look for when you go out there and start making your first purchases. By the end of this video, you should feel far more confident about the kinds of paints that you would choose for your artwork given where you're at in your art journey. This tutorial was taken from my new course on Patreon called Getting Comfortable and Confident with Oil Paint. So let's dive in. So what makes up oil paint? So oil paint is a combination of powdered pigments made from a variety of different substances mixed with a little bit of binder and a lot of oil. And so mixed together into like a pasty material that we call oil paint. So what kind of different pigments do they use? Well, these pigments can be used from a lot of different things. They can be made from earth substances, ground minerals, animal materials, and there's a lot of synthetic colors out there right now. Also, oil paints were not always in the form that you see them now. This is a relatively modern invention of maybe, I don't know, 150 years old or so. Before then, the artist would simply get the powdered pigments and then bring them back to the studio, and they would then have to mix and grind their own oil paint by adding oil to the pigment powder and then grinding it with a glass or metal pestle into the pasty substance. It was very expensive, very laborious, and time-consuming. It's really only a function of the Industrial Revolution that they were able to manufacture these paints and put them into tubes. A lot of the colors that we see now and the huge variety of colors that we have, they're a function of modern chemistry and contemporary manufacturing methods. And the oils that they use to mix with the paint are generally one of about 4 different oils. The most popular is linseed oil, which is from grinding flax seeds. There's also walnut oil, safflower oil, and also sometimes poppy oil. And they just mix the oil with a little bit of binder with the paint, and then it'll give you the consistency that you want for the oil paint. They refer to them as drying oils, but actually they don't really dry. What they do is they absorb the oxygen from the air, and then they slowly begin to gel and then harden. And over a long period of time, they can actually become quite brittle. That's why sometimes when we see old oil paintings, the surface of the paint can be all cracked. And that's why it's very important when you're working with oil paints to begin to understand the chemistry and the proper procedures that you use to avoid this cracking process. Depending on where you live is your accessibility to paint. I live in Canada, therefore Winsor Newton is very popular. Where I live, it's very accessible. It's not a problem getting it. They're a very good brand. Gamblin is also very accessible. Where I live, it's a very good brand as well. It's a little cheaper than Winsor Newton, but it's a good brand. Also, there's Old Holland. Now, this is probably one of the best brands of paint that you can get out there. It's fantastic paint, wonderful quality, but it's very expensive. You know, it depends on what you need it for. But their tinting quality, like there's very high quality pigments, a lot of pigment in the paint, and therefore they're extremely good to paint with. Paints come in different sizes. You've got, this is a very large tube. This is a 200 milliliter tube. I like getting the big tubes, particularly for white. I always get it for white because that's probably the most used color on your palette. And I also use like the Griffin Alkyd. It's my titanium white as well because it's a fast dryer. Different, and then you have these kinds of sizes, which are 37 milliliter, and this is generally about a 40 milliliter. These are the most common. Sometimes you can get smaller ones. I guess they're tester tubes, but generally these two sizes here are the most common. Most manufacturers will have 2 different qualities of paint. So the Winsor Newton, we'll go back to them. They have, like for instance this, they have an artist quality, and then they have what's usually considered student quality. And what distinguishes it, like for instance the Winsor Newton, they're called artists oil paint. This one is called Winsor Newton, and it's called Winton oil color. And the Winton, basically what distinguishes it from the artist quality is that it's usually full of filler. They're trying to extend the volume of the paint in order to make more paint for the buck. And so therefore they can make it cheaper. Even if you're learning, better to start with a smaller range of colors and a limited palette than get cheaper paint. Sometimes I couldn't get an alternate color, and other times I've ordered it by mistake online. I thought it was a Winsor Newton, when it came it was a Winton. So that's how I ended up with these ones. The problem with these cheaper paints is that they have a very low ratio of pigment to the oil, the binder, and the fillers that are in the paint, and therefore they don't have a great tinting power when it comes to mixing your paints. You can be using a lot of paint to try and bring a color up in terms of chroma or saturation, and it's just not working. It looks fine coming out of the tube, but it just doesn't react well with the other paints when you mix them. And as a result, you're either using a lot of paint in order to get the effect that you want, or you don't get the effect at all, which is extremely frustrating. So in the end, you end up wasting money rather than saving money because you just simply can't get the effect that you want. Also, paint pigments, they have different qualities to them. So some of them have a very coarse pigment, like in other words, they've ground it up into, like a flour, a powdery substance, but the different, under a microscope, the particles would be different. So the larger particles tend to be heavier, and it depends on what they're made of. And then particularly synthetics, they're very, very fine, and they have a tendency to be a lot lighter. And also, smaller particles can be what they call very thirsty. They require a lot more oil in order to get a consistency and to mix well in order to create the paint than some of these denser materials. This titanium white, and even Griffin and this one here, they're both the same size, but this is a far more dense paint than this one here. I'm lifting up this cadmium, which is a natural mineral substance. It's very, very heavy. The same with this white. It's a very heavy tube of paint. You pick up Prussian blue, it's so much lighter. Like, it's really, you think, oh my gosh, is there the same amount of paint? There is, but it's the way the paint is distributed by virtue of the mineral and the oil. This has a lot more oil, that's why it's a lot lighter. These have a lot more of the pigment and the mineral that's in there, and they're much more heavy. Now, the oil to pigment ratio will affect paint sometimes in different ways. Sometimes it'll make it quite thick and pasty, almost clay-like, or this one is a new tube of paint, and when I open it up, you can see there's oil dripping. Like, the oil has come to the surface of this tube, and you can see that it's very, very oily and very drippy. Oil oozing literally out of this thing. So what do you do when that happens? Well, you just kind of, when you open it up, all you have to do is basically blot it with that. Actually get down to the pigment. I opened one earlier, and you can see the amount of oil that came off of the screen. It was just oozing with oil when I first opened it up. When we're dealing with these paints in terms of the kinds of elements that go up to make the quality of the paint in terms of, their heaviness, or whether they're organic or inorganic or synthetic or whatever, they also have a number of different characteristics to them. So when you're out there shopping for a tube of paint and you pick it up and you're looking at it, when you look at the label, there's a lot of information on it that will actually tell you a lot about the specific characteristics of that paint. When you look at the back of your tube of paint, you will notice a number of different things. We'll get into all these different bits of information that are on the label. So one of the things that it talks about is that it's either transparent or opaque or semi-transparent. So I'm going to show you a number of different tubes here, and you'll see that all three of them have a different square. This one has a square with a line through it, this one has a solid square, and this one has an open square. What that means is the opacity or the transparency of the paint. If it's got a line through the middle of it, it means it's semi-transparent. If it's got a black square, it means it's opaque. And if it's got a white square, it means it's transparent. It means that's the nature of the paint. Something like the CAD, these are very heavy and you can feel it. It's a very heavy tube of paint, but also look at the paint. You can see very thick and it's very opaque. When you look at something like an alizarin crimson, for instance, actually a transparent paint, and you can see it even here. So you can see with the titanium white is very thick and opaque. The cadmiums are opaque, titanium is opaque, umbers, all of those tend to be opaque paints. Transparent paints tend to be a lot of the jewel tones, for instance, the alizarin, Prussian blue, the ultramarine blue, all of the phthalos, all these kinds of things. They tend to be the dioxazine, anything that sort of sounds, chemically like, or from a laboratory, they have a tendency to be a lot more transparent. Okay, so let's talk about the nature of transparency or opacity with your paint and how that would impact the choices that you make in terms of how you would use it at a certain point in your painting. So I've got three different types of paint here, and they're all the same color, so they're very, very similar. I've got a cadmium red medium, which is an opaque paint. I've got a Windsor red, which is a semi-transparent paint, and an alizarin crimson, which is transparent. They're all a deep, vibrant red, and we're going to test it on this line test so you can be able to see just how much of what's underneath will actually come through when you're painting. So let's start first with the Cad red. And I'm just going to use straight paint. So this is opaque. So you can see that it literally covers the line. This is the semi-transparent paint. It's interesting, you pick up the paint tube, but you can feel it's a whole lot lighter. It feels very different. Clean my brush off. I'm not adding any medium to any of these paints. You can even feel the consistency is different. See a bit of the line comes through. And this is the alizarin crimson. You can see it's a much darker red. And again, the consistency feels really different. And you can see that the black comes right through. Even though it's a very deep color on its own, it comes right through the line. So how would this dictate what you use? Well, for instance, if you were going to be glazing, this alizarin would be much better. You could use a lot of oil, a little bit of this red, and it would be a much better choice to do glazing with, particularly with skin tones, because the alizarin actually works very well with most skin tones. Also, when we are talking about the names of paints, sometimes it's just about the color, sometimes the region. So here we have 2 tubes of paint. They're called burnt sienna and raw sienna. And what that is the color of the earth near the city of Siena in Italy. And so that's where it gets its name from. The umbers are always about earth tones. These cadmiums, that's the material that actually makes up the paint. So that actually determines the name. Cadmium red, cadmium orange, cadmium yellow, cadmium green, all these sort of things. These are naturally occurring minerals and determine the name of the particular paint. And you always know when you're dealing with CADs that they're expensive. They're also very high tinting quality. They're very good paints. Then we have ones like quinacridone violet. This is a manufactured name. We have a dioxidine violet, and all of the phthalo colors. They're all done in the laboratory. You'll see paints that have a lot of very different names. Scarlet Lake, Rose Madder, they'll be called Windsor Blue, Windsor Red, various names of people that invented these paints, all kinds of different proprietary names that don't necessarily have anything to do with specifically that color. And these names are only found quite often within a certain name brand range. So sometimes it's very important to understand the details of what it is that you're buying, not necessarily going by the name. When you're trying to get color matching of any kind, what they have is a universal color labeling system. And what you'll see is that on each one, they will have pigment. So it's called pigment, and then you'll see a number. PR255, PR254. This says PY138, PG7, and PW6. What does that mean? It means there's 3 different pigments that went into making up that paint. And what that means is that the P stands for pigment, the letter after it stands for the color group, in this case is red, and then it's the number 255, PR. So I've got pigment red 255 and pigment red 254. And this is a proprietary color, for instance, Windsor red. Why? Because Winsor Newton makes it. So you won't find a Windsor red anywhere else. And so you'll see that in a lot of different manufacturers. They have their own proprietary colors. But if you're trying to match up a color, let's say you run out of some Scarlet Lake or Rose Madder, or you want a transparent paint, or you want something different about it, what you're going to look for are these numbers here in order to match it up. PO20, pigment orange 20, and pigment red 108. Okay, so that'll tell you what went into making this particular cadmium orange. And they basically fall into, a category of a color. So there's PB, which is a pigment blue, BK is black, BR is brown, G is green, Y yellow, R red, O orange, V for violet, W for white, and N for neutral. So those are the different categories that you'll find in this labeling system. And that number is called a color index name or number. That's what it means. So aside from the number, they'll also give you the oil that this paint is suspended in. In this particular case, it happens to be safflower oil. And in this case, I've got linseed oil and safflower oil. So you can see that there's a variety of different combinations that go into making up the paint. Also on the label, you'll see an indicator called light fastness or permanence. And this is actually really, really important because it gives you an indication of how stable that particular color is. Some colors are very sensitive to light and they will fade quite easily. They're called fugitive paints. Others are very, very stable and they don't change. So this is something to consider when you are buying the paint, just where it's going to be located and also for what reason that you're doing it. If you're doing a professional commission and you want to be sure that it's going to be stable and it's going to look good 100 years from now, then you need to buy paints that are very, very high quality in their light fastness characteristics. Light fastness 1, or it will say here a permanent A. Permanent AA, and in this one it says permanent B. What does that mean? Permanent has to do with light fastness, how stable the paint is and how it's affected by lights. If it says on the back of the tube, a light fastness 1, that's a good thing. That means it's quite stable, and you'll notice that it says a permanence is A, which is very good. This is permanence AA, which is really, really good. Permanence B means it's more unstable, or the higher the number on the back, the more unstable it becomes. Also, these paints all come in a series. So when the manufacturers make up the tubes of paint, they're going to be different qualities, and obviously the substances that go into making these paints, the pigments, are going to be more expensive, and so they'll put them in a series. So generally when you go to the art store, you will see your rack of paint, and then you will see a little sign underneath saying Series 1, Series 2, Series 3. Series 1 may be $15 a tube, Series 2 may be $20 a tube, Series 3 $25 a tube, and a Series 4 may be up to as much as $40 a tube. Now, I'm saying this in Canadian dollars, but just do the math and make sort of relative jumps. Also, these Old Holland paints, they will be just the basic paints will be sometimes, twice the price. The quality of the paint and the materials that go into making it does determine the price. So let's take a look at some of these here. This is a Series 1. So this is a relatively inexpensive tube of paint. And this, for instance, is one of their proprietary paints, and this is a Series 2. So it's a little more expensive than this one. All the cadmiums here are a Series 4, which makes them a lot more expensive. It's probably easily twice the price of a Series 1. On the Gamblins, that this is a Series 3. Sometimes you're making your choices based on, for instance, this Windsor red, while it's nice and bright, it's close to a cadmium red, but I can tell you the cadmium red would cost easily twice. Also, on some of these tubes, you'll see there'll be a little sign, this. And that basically talks about its toxicity. So this shows the little sign with a tree and earth and a little fish. Basically means it's not good for the environment. So you want to be aware of that in terms of getting any on your skin and how you dispose of these tubes of paint. So if they have this sign, don't just throw them in the garbage. When you're disposing of your mineral spirits or whatnot, be sure to sort of put these things in a container and take them to the recycle center and make sure that they're properly disposed of. Well, I hope this guide to oil paints gave you a better understanding as to what to look for as a beginner in terms of buying colors and different brands. And if you'd like to dive into oil painting but you're not really sure how to get started, go to the link at the end of this video to my Patreon site and find out how. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, please check out my other videos, and also like, share, and subscribe for more transformational art videos coming your way. Please let me know in the comments below what you would like to learn next in terms of oil painting. And be sure to look in the description below for a special discount offer by Meeden Art Supplies. Thanks very much for watching, happy painting, and we'll see you in the next video.